Welcome to the Mighty Oaks Show. It is great to have you with us today and excited about our show. But before we jump into our conversation, I want to remind you, if you have not yet, please go ahead and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We have this show and a lot of other content that we push out, and we do it so that you can be helped, and would love for you to participate in that. So subscribe to the channel, very important. Hit the notification bell. That lets you know when more content comes online. And go ahead and send this out to other people. You can also comment in the comment area there, and we would love to follow up with you there. If you are listening somewhere else, I know folks listen over at our partners at Mojo 50 or on one of the podcast sites. Thank you for listening. Take some time when we're done to go over to YouTube and check us out. And again, we'd love to connect there. And excited about our conversation today. Today we are talking to one of the most mysterious roles in the United States military. That is the role of the chaplain. We all know chaplains. We like chaplains. We're thankful for chaplains, but not everyone has had the opportunity to kind of look behind the curtain and see a chaplain out of uniform, and we have one today. And so excited about it today. Talking to Emile Moured, and we'll call him Mo, because that's how everyone knows Chaplain Mo. But we've gotten to know each other a little bit kind of over the last year or so. A lot of mutual friends and some mutual projects we're involved in. Haven't met in person yet, although we've had a lot of contact. But really glad to have you with us. And man, just appreciate you taking time to talk to us and telling your story.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Glad to be on the Mighty Oaks program with you guys. This is wonderful. You do so many great, awesome things for our brothers in arms. It's just awesome to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have the conversation, and I want to get to some of the work that you're doing right now, really to do some of what we're doing. You know, our show and the podcast and the other things that we do are really so that we can catalog helpful information that hopefully people will get a hold of and they'll be able to use. And really, you're doing that right now with a lot of the folks that you work with. But talk to us about kind of your start, where you grew up. How you made the move into the military, and specifically the chaplaincy. I've got a lot of great friends who are chaplains, but I think for a lot of people in the military, it is kind of a mystery. Like, he's a chaplain, but we don't know where he came from or where he went to school or why he's here. We know that he helps us and he's around, but talk to that a little bit if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. Given me an opportunity to share my story, which is really a story of God's grace in the life of a very average person who's an example that God uses the weak and the foolish things of this world to share his own glory and power. So I was started off as a young man growing up in Boston, you know, the typical kid, lower middle class family. Always thought I'd go in the military because my dad was a World War II infantry vet. He went through the Battle of the Bulge and through Germany, and he was even one of the guards with first, for your soldiers, they would know that the 1st Infantry Division stood guard at the trials at Nuremberg. He was one of them. And it was just always part of my DNA. I was going to be in the military. And fast forward to teenager, applying to the academies, applying to college, looking for scholarships. And I had an opportunity to fly with the Navy and to go to an engineering school. They were willing to pay my way. And a year into that, I went to Pensacola to fly, to do sort of what they call Quartermid, which was really sort of like a career day for midshipmen. And while I was down there, I fell in love with it. I thought, man, I'm here. I'm flying, and I've got my college now about to be paid for the rest of the time that I'm at this engineering school. What more could I want? And it was almost as if God waited for that moment to just tap me on the shoulder and say, this is good, but I've got something else for you. And that was a hard decision, but I ended up deciding it was maybe better to invest myself in having an impact for people for eternity as a pastor, as a chaplain with the military, rather than as a pilot. Although being a pilot would have been a great choice as well.
Yeah.
So fast forward to seminary, I am looking at the possibility of coming on active duty. And at that point, the Lord tapped me on the shoulder again and said, I know this is in your heart. I know I've given you this direction, but I've got something else for you for now. And that's when I met my wonderful wife, Rhonda, who is from Canada. And I just felt really strongly convicted that I needed to spend time really nurturing that relationship right out of the gate. After graduation from seminary, we got married. And then I spent 4 years planting churches and pastoring in the Northwest, in the Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington area, and came on active duty in 2000.
Yeah. Were you raised in a Christian home, or was that something that you, kind of a journey that you took on your own?
So I was raised in a Christian home, and my mom and my dad were very strong in their own faith. I was raised in an Eastern Orthodox home, which, for those who don't know, it's sort of like Catholic in many respects, but without the Pope and some very minor differences in theology. I will say that I did not know God during that. I was getting to know God. I think that experience gave me a very strong sense of the transcendence of God, or basically the fact that he's a real holy God, and he's not us, and we're very distant and separate from him, and we need to bridge that gap. I don't think I ever really realized that I needed to exercise personal faith in Jesus Christ and his work on the cross, until one day I was 10 years old, and we went to an evening service just at a local Bible church, which happens to be sort of the tradition I remained in and the tradition I'm in now. And the pastor gave a very clear gospel message that, you're a sinner, that Christ had to die for your sins, and he's not going to force it on you because he's a gentleman. But if you accept that, you don't have to pay for the consequences, the punishment of your own sin, that he's done it for you. And it was like everything just came together in that moment. It was like, oh, right, that's why Jesus had to die. That's, I had all the puzzle pieces, and we even recited this in the creeds every Sunday in the church I grew up in. But it wasn't until that moment that it became just crystal clear, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. And I really did, even though I was 10, I really did understand it fully. Fully enough, right? I'm not sure we ever understand it fully. It's a journey. But I grasped the sobriety and the reality of what the pastor was sharing, and I committed my life to Christ at that time. And for those next 8 years, I worked with inner city ministries and youth groups, and would even go and do what I thought I needed to be doing at the time. I'd grab a Bible and go to the park, the inner city park, and just share Jesus with whoever would listen. And so it became a very integral part of who I am at that point.
Did your family start to go to that church as well, or was that something you said, I'm going to start going to this other church?
So a little of both. So my family, for not theological reasons, for other reasons, they were a little discontent with the church that we were going to, and they also were trying to get my sister into the Christian school, or wanted her to be integrated into this Christian school at this church. So we started going there, but I'll tell you, I felt like I was the one, before I could get my license and drive, I felt like I was the one chomping at the bit to get in the car and go to Sunday evening services and Wednesday night services and all the rest. I was just eating it up. The teaching was great, and I just felt like my relationship with God was just growing exponentially during those years.
You obviously feel like you believe that faith is an important component for those who are serving in the military. And we'll get to some more of how you're doing that specifically, but this is something we discuss a lot. But from your perspective as a chaplain, as someone who has a cross on his collar and is the designated religious person in the unit, and you're the guy that people are supposed to go to, it seems like there would be some, I don't know exactly what the word is, but you're kind of the guy that people go to when they need to talk to someone. And for you, as someone who believes that faith is extremely important, it's not a religious exercise, it's not something that you just encounter when you're having a hard time. How do you communicate to the people that you're working with that faith should be the foundation, that faith should be kind of that through thread, that thing that carries through your life regardless of where you are? How do you, as kind of the professional, quote unquote, communicate that to the men and women that you're serving?
Great question, Jeremy. I think a lot of folks struggle with that, not just chaplains. Because you're right, when you put the quotes around professional, there's none of us that are professionals. We're
Right.
really not called to ministry when we get a paycheck or a title. We're called to ministry when we come to Christ, or when we're called to Christ, regardless of who you are, whether you're 10 or you're 80,
Yep.
or whether you're called pastor or not, right? So I think this is a great question for all of us. And for me in particular, I mean, it's just a matter of saying it. Then the question might be, well, how and when? And I think that differs for every person and every conversation. I think about when Nicodemus came to Jesus, right, at night, and he comes and he asks him these questions, these very key core questions about faith. And Jesus says to him, well, you have to be born of water and the Spirit. And Nicodemus is like, what does that even mean? And he's like, well, you got to be born again. And now you and I have used and have heard that phrase so many thousands of times that it seems common. But at that time, I'm not sure anybody had ever used that phrase, born again. And so again, Nicodemus is sort of like, what are you talking about? My paraphrase, obviously, not his actual words in John 3. But my point is just to say, even Jesus himself, he could have very easily laid it all out there at that moment, right? He could have said, okay, well, look, here, you're a Pharisee, or you're part of this council, this religious group of folk who should know all of this stuff, all of these scriptures. So let me just lay it out for you really clear. Here's what the prophets said. Here's what they meant. Here's who I am. I'm God in human flesh. And oh, by the way, I'm going to die. And when I die on a cross, it's not just the physical death. In some way that you may not be able to understand, your sin is going to be put on my body, on my person, and I'm going to pay for that, just like as if I could replace you on death row. That's what I'm going to do. Any questions? He doesn't do that. He goes, oh, you got to be born again. My point is just to say, I think you have to be sensitive to who you're talking to, what the timing is, and how to present the message. And a lot of that's being prayerful. And a lot of that is making sure, too, that you take the time to build relationships with people. There's the old adage I'm sure you've heard and maybe used, that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that's especially true. A lot of the folks that we work with have heard about Jesus. They've heard about God. And because I wear a cross on my collar, or depending on which uniform I'm wearing, it might be here, people almost expect that of me. What they really want to know first is, are you willing to listen? Do you want to know me? Or as a chaplain, as a professional, are you looking to put another notch in the staff that you walk around with, the metaphorical shepherd's crook or whatever. But there's times where it's very deliberate, very overt. And there's other times where it gets weaved into the story. And at some point, I'll tell you this, though, I always get to a point where I just let them know in some way, hey, if you want help, I'm going to do the best I can to help you. But I'm just going to tell you right now that you have a much higher chance of success with God fighting in your corner than you do doing this alone. And furthermore, if you really want to make sure that your effort is invested in things of eternal value, you absolutely have to get God in your corner. Otherwise, we're just kind of putting Band-Aids on a second chest wound.
How important is your personal credibility with the people that you serve with? I think of my time in an infantry battalion, and we had a number of chaplains that would come in and out, and they were all great, and I got to know all of them because I come from a Christian home and I was raised by a pastor, and so that was my connection, and so I would go and spend time with them. But for a lot of Marines, that wasn't the case. There were, however, some chaplains that had very deliberately worked to develop a credibility outside of their office, outside of kind of their calling with those Marines, and the influence those chaplains had was incredible. I think specifically of a couple of guys, but one you may be familiar with, Chaplain Kerry Cash.
Oh yeah, Kerry and I are good friends.
Yeah, he was our chaplain during our Iraq deployment, and you knew he was a chaplain because you knew that, but the Marines treated him like, he was someone with extreme credibility that could be trusted, and they leaned on him when they might not have otherwise. How do you maintain that type of credibility that gives you the opportunity to serve and to talk and to influence?
Man, that credibility really is so important, because nobody's going to listen to a thing you say, and nobody's probably even going to give you the time of day if you don't have that. And it's especially important in a Marine battalion where people are literally entrusting their lives to each other, right? I think there's at least a couple of things that, whether consciously or subconsciously, chaplains need to do to make sure that we earn that trust and then protect that trust. And one of those, you use the word confidentiality, I believe. And, the folks need to know that if you're on active duty or you're a dependent or whatever, and you talk to an active duty chaplain, they are obligated to maintain complete confidentiality. I mean, I've had folks tell me, I don't want to say stuff you wouldn't believe, because you might actually, as a former grunt, but I've had people confess to the absolute worst things that a human being could imagine, knowing that I was that final backstop, knowing that, well, I really want to get this out and I need to talk about it to somebody, but I'm so afraid of consequences. But if I talk to the chaplain, he can't talk to anybody. And I will have people sometimes sit in my office, especially the worse the offense, the greater the risk in their eyes. And so they will sit there and ask me repeatedly, like, is this really confidential? Like, what if you go to court? Or, what if you get a subpoena? Or what if the commanding officer, and I've had commanding officers sit down in front of me, slamming their fist on the table saying, you will tell me, yada, yada, yada. And I've said, no, sir, I really can't. And the importance there is for folks to have one last outlet that they know is going to protect their soul's confession and confidence. Otherwise, they're just going to keep bottling it up, and it's going to be like a wound that festers and creates some significant negative consequences for them and those around them. So first, protecting confidentiality. I think the other thing is just how you conduct yourself, certainly morally, ethically. I've known chaplains or Christians who feel like in order to maintain credibility, they have to do everything that their fellow Marines or sailors or soldiers or airmen do. And obviously, once you do that, you may earn some friends, but you discredit the Lord, and you really, in the long run, end up discrediting yourself. So moral and ethical uprightness is certainly important, but also just being approachable, being friendly, being real. There's some folks who are just they're such stuffed shirts, they're so stuck on themselves, or they feel like that. And I would say this is not just chaplains in the military, this is anybody, and it certainly includes pastors in civilian ministry. And I think a lot of that is a fear of people knowing who you are. If you're transparent, they'll see the ugly side, and then you'll be discredited. Well, kind of works sort of counterintuitively, I guess, that way, where you actually kind of need to be transparent, or people aren't going to trust you. Why should I entrust you with my stuff if I sense that you're a fake, right? Sure. So I think those are two things among several that are important to earning trust and confidence.
When you were pastoring and you transitioned into the chaplaincy, what was the catalyst for you to? I think you were a reserve chaplain while you were pastoring, but what was the catalyst for you to transition from one ministry kind of to another ministry?
Well, I had always had it in my mind's eye. I think the vision that God gave me, and I don't use that word with a capital V, I just mean the desire he put in my heart was to always be on active duty. And it was, I think, more a matter of when rather than if. And the timing was just a matter of me going before the Lord as a pastor at the time, saying, Father, before I walk away from this particular church that I'm at right now in good conscience to go fulfill this other calling, I feel like 4 things need to happen. And I just laid those out before the Lord. I don't remember what they all were now. I remember one of them was I wanted to bring up at least 3 more men. We wanted to see at least 3 more men brought up into leadership, onto the elder team. And there were a few other things, and it was amazing. I mean, it's really not amazing, but it was awesome. Yeah. Within, I believe it was about 4 weeks, all of those things just boom, 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 fell into place. I was like, all right, here we go.
I guess we're doing this.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and that's the great thing about, when God's in something, he will blow open doors. even before, I'll be a little transparent here myself. Even before I came on active duty, I remember I was talking to a chaplain corps detailer. Some of our older chaplains who are watching this may remember a guy by the name of Jim McNew. He was a Catholic priest. And I remember talking to him, and in the old application form, it asked if you'd ever been arrested for a misdemeanor or felony. And it didn't ask if you'd ever been convicted of one or what the details were. It just said, have you ever been arrested for one? Well, the answer was, yeah, I had. At that point, earlier in my life, as a slightly younger man, I was not convicted. However, it got thrown out because I shouldn't have been arrested, but that's irrelevant. Point is, I told him this story, and he remember him just taking a deep breath and waiting, and he goes, I'll be honest with you. He said, I doubt if you got more than a 2% chance of getting in, because that's a showstopper. And I said, okay. And I remember hanging up the phone and just thinking, this is great, because this is all on God,
So clear, right?
Right. He either blows open the door and says, nothing's going to frustrate my plans, and so this is gone, or he's going to say, well, I had different plans for you, and I'm going to use this to redirect you somewhere else. And I remember just not worrying about it at all. So God has his ways of getting us where he wants us to be.
Do you feel like your time planting churches has been helpful as you've served as a chaplain?
Oh, yeah, man, alive. I'll tell you, the very first billet I ever had, I came on active duty to start up a credo. I don't know if you're familiar with those, Jeremy, but they are retreat-based, seminar-based ministries that chaplains run in the Marine Corps and in the Navy. And they asked me to come start one up. And my boss wasn't going to be reporting for, I want to say, a few months after I got there. And a lot of folks thought, man, we're setting this guy up for failure. He's never been a chaplain on active duty. He's never served at a cradle, let alone started one up. This is going to go horribly. But I didn't share with you is while I was pastoring, I was working simultaneously as a mental health therapist at a couple different adolescent programs in the Portland area. I'd been running groups every day for 4 years and starting up a church at the same time. And so when I got there, I was like, I don't want to sound arrogant or overconfident, but I wasn't, it didn't bother me. I wasn't worried about it, and things went really well. Ever since, your question was, do I feel like my experience church planting helped me? Ever since then, I think the way it helped is I look at every billet, every situation I'm in as an opportunity to continue to reach out to people, to not necessarily plant churches, although when I'm at an installation, I have certainly started up worship services with the same energy and the same optimism, the same vision of a church planter, and seen those grow. But even when I've been with a battalion or a regiment or on a ship, I invest myself into that, with whether that body of believers is 5 or whether that body of believers is 150. I throw myself into that sort of traditional expression of ministry, just like I did when I was pastoring. Yeah. And I think there's so much that comes out of that, because as you infuse encouragement and hope and teaching truth to others, they then go out and they become sort of these encouragers, and they build up, the rest of the folks, and they're able to have conversations with the other thousands of Marines or sailors that you just simply don't have the time to reach.
Yeah, that's awesome. One thing I know about the chaplaincy, and again, having friends who are chaplains and people who have been chaplains for some time, there is almost a corporate structure to the chaplaincy, as there is, throughout the military. How do you, particularly the longer you're in, and the more you grow in rank and influence and opportunity, how do you maintain your heart for people, for the individual, for the man or woman who's hurting, who's struggling? And that's not just a question for chaplain. That would be for, probably all people everywhere.
Yeah.
You start into something because you care about people, but after a while, it's possible to become so overwhelmed with everything else that you lose your heart for that. How do you maintain your heart for the people that you serve?
Wow. Another great question. And it's interesting because I was just thinking about this last night. I was actually editing an interview where the Marine I was talking to says that, with all of his post-traumatic stress and all of the things he's been trying to recover from, and, feeling suicidal, struggling with drug addiction, all this stuff, he said the one thing that he's never lost is his compassion, his love for other people. And apart from, I'd say faith is number one, but apart from that, I think your compassion for your ability to empathize for others, and to continue to get outside of yourself and look at things through the perspective of other folks' lens, it's critical. I mean, whether you're a combat vet, whether, like you said, you're just a human being living life, compassion is a greatly underrated trait. It's a human trait, but even a leadership trait. How do I do it? I think part of it starts with my daily walk with God. If I'm in his word and I'm praying, I'm going to see things from a slightly different perspective. It's going to start that process of me getting out of myself and seeing things from a higher perspective that puts things, it's like the difference between being stuck in the trees when you're backpacking or hunting, and suddenly being on the mountaintop and being able to see the landscape and realizing, oh, okay, it's not nearly as dreadful or chaotic or difficult as I thought. But then what happens is you realize there's a sort of a third leg in that stool, or a third angle in that triangle, or however you want to look at it. And that is not just how you relate to God. And, it's not only what you do to take care of yourself, it's now how I relate to others, because you quickly begin to realize that God has put me on this earth for as long as I'm on this earth to serve him by serving others. And so you start doing that, whether it's out of obedience or discipline, or just a sense of trying to get away from sort of that self-pity or self-loathing that can even hard Marines can get stuck in, and starting to think about how can I help somebody else. And then all of a sudden you do that, and it's amazing how that just lifts your spirits. And so I think part of it is just having experienced that often enough to just know, like, I think my wife would be the first to tell you, I'm not the kind of person when things are down to just, sit there and sort of bemoan the things I can't control, or the things that have happened, or to frame them in a negative light. It's like at some point you go, okay, it is what it is, and let's press forward. And I'm not sure I put as much conscious thought into it. But the other piece I was thinking of is for those of us that are chaplains, those of us that are in caregiving roles, it can be really easy to burn out. And so it goes back to maybe the first thing I said, which is I need to constantly nurture my own walk with God, because you can only pour out from that which is already filled up. And if I am not allowing the Lord to fill me up, if I'm not allowing others to build me up, lift me up, because God uses others too. It's not just me sort of being a hermit with the Bible and prayer. It's also relationships. If I don't allow God to build me up, then I'm going to get empty really, really fast. And that is a huge danger for folks in ministry and Christians in general, is the ones that are very compassionate, is they give and they give and they give, and they don't take the time to nurture their inner man, just like Jesus did. Remember how many times he tried to pull away from the crowds and get to the mountaintop and just spend time with God in prayer, or pull away with either John or Peter, James, and John, or the 12, and just spend time with that closer knit group of people. So we even have that model from the God-man himself.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day in terms of kind of what we're going through right now. So much fear in our society and our culture right now, and so much uncertainty, and a lot of it's warranted, some of it's not, but there's a lot of that. And if there's anyone who should be able to provide comfort and speak truth, it's Christians. I mean, we know that this is not the end, that there is a God who's sovereign, who's in control, and regardless of what happens in the next couple of months or the next years, it doesn't matter. God is still God, and we know that. But I think so many Christians fail to to invest in their lives, to invest in their walk with God, that when these crisis moments come, they're not equipped to help people who really need to be helped. And I think that's so important to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. There's a human tendency in times like this to sort of withdraw and go into sort of this protective mode, right? And yet that is so self-defeating in the end. Um, and it may seem, again, counterintuitive, but it's actually by reaching out. You think of what the early church did when we read the book of Acts and how they shared everything in common, and the ones that had a lot shared with those who didn't have
Right.
much, and they took care of each other. But that's a spirit of God thing. People don't naturally say, I'm really concerned about my future. I'm not sure what's going to happen a year from now, 6 months from now, but I'm going to give to you anyway because
Sure.
your situation is even more bleak, or because you really need it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're called to do. And you just find so much joy and peace in that once you do it.
Yeah, what an important perspective. You've served a lot of people over the years. You've done a lot of work with 7th Marines, and a lot of folks who are watching would know kind of the story of 7th Marines and just some of the issues they've dealt with over the last few years. Many would not. Can you talk about your work there, kind of what you got dropped into, what they as a regiment have dealt with, and just tell the story of what you're doing there, what you've seen, what you've experienced, what's happened.
Sure. So the 7th Marines is in 29 Palms, California, in the middle of the desert. It's a great training area. They were pushing out. I mean, I think the whole Marine Corps was, but they were pushing out a lot of battalions. The op tempo was very, very high back in the early mid 2000s. 27 before their 2008 deployment had done, I believe, I want to say 3 combat deployments. And they had done to include 2 very intense combat deployments in Iraq that left them with something around, and I apologize, I'm not going to get the figure right off the top of my head, but something in the 20s, as far as KIAs. I actually have the figures here somewhere. But yeah, about in 4 years of deployments, about 29 KIAs. And 2 of those operations, by the way, were in Fallujah, which I know you're familiar with as well. So then in 2008, they turn right around and they do yet another deployment, but this time to Afghanistan. And just to be clear, I was not with them at this point. I didn't join them until they got back. And that's where my story with them picks up. But they had a pretty tough combat deployment at the time. Now, there were some significantly harder, I think, combat deployments just in terms of sheer numbers after that as well. But at the time, that year they were called the hardest hit battalion in the Marine Corps. They ended up with 19 KIAs, 160 wounded in action, and I believe 30 of those, roughly 30, I may have the number wrong, the exact number wrong, but 30 were amputees. And they were spread out in just a very large area. So I'm not sure what area you were, how large the area was that you were in control of in Iraq, but the area that they were responsible for in Afghanistan was roughly the size of Vermont or Maryland. It was a pretty huge swath. Most of that was in Helmand. Some of it was in the Farah province. And so you can just imagine what that's like. You've got company commanders and even platoon commanders spread out and in charge of not just areas, but making daily decisions that are pretty tough for young men to have to make. And of course, I say men. I realize you probably have women watching as well, but these are infantry battalions in 2008, which were strictly men. And so they began to experience it was reported at least that they had the highest suicide rate in the Marine Corps. I don't know if that's still true, but there certainly continues to be this sort of story that 27 is known for fighting hard and losing a lot of their own to suicide. So when I got there in 2009, I was told at the time they were going to send me actually to 1-7 because they thought they were going to push out next, and then they said no, we're going to send you to 2-7 because right now they've got this really big issue with suicide. We want you to try to take a look at that and to understand it. And of course, being Marines, you know, they wanted me to fix it, right?
Right.
And so I went in there with just an open mind. And the first thing I did was I took about 12 Marines. I don't think there were any sailors in that group. 12 Marines. And I said, we're going to get in civilian clothes. We're going to go off site and we're just going to have a conversation for a day. And we actually went to a chapel, and I think it took them a little bit of time to warm up to me, but I went at it, and this is 2008. We know a lot. We have a much better sense of why people are killing themselves now than we did back then. But at the time, you may remember, we all just assumed, well, these are combat related. You know, we got folks who are experiencing combat stress, and so this is a result of PTSD. Well, as I did this interview, I had this list of questions that I was intending to pursue that were all kind of based on that premise. But when I asked the first question, how many of you have been deployed? How many of you have been to combat? 10 of the 12 had never even been deployed. And the other 2 had seen marginal combat. And these are obviously guys who had attempted suicide, not been successful. So I wasn't collecting data for the ones that had killed themselves. But at the time, I thought, well, this is a revelation. Of course, we now know that is sort of common, that it's actually, it's a sort of a protective thing to be with a team in combat, to have that sense of togetherness and mission and meaning. But it's the ones we're mostly concerned about are the young guys. Yep. So that in and of itself is a pretty long story. And I actually did a PME at 7th Marines last June and kind of broke this down and came up with about a dozen lessons learned that were partially from that, just that focus group, that one-day focus group that I did. But also from the ongoing work that I've done for the last 12 years, 10 years since leaving 2-7, with the veterans, because obviously the suicide rate among the veterans continues to be higher than we'd never like to see anybody kill themselves, but it's a lot higher than we would hope for. And I don't think you want the PME here this afternoon, but one of the things that was very clear is how important it is that we shape our messaging. And I don't just mean going out and telling people don't kill yourselves, but actually a lot of those suicide prevention briefs aren't really suicide prevention, they're suicide intervention. They're very heavy, they're very sobering, and nobody leaves those briefs feeling like, man, I am excited now to live my life and go, attack the world, right? So those have a place, don't get me wrong.
I think this is a very, very important point, and a point that a lot of people misunderstand, particularly those who aren't in the military. When you say a suicide intervention brief, I know exactly what that means, and I could not agree with you more. We're trying to prevent something really bad when we should be, 3 years out in front of it.
Right.
Can you, for those who don't understand that, break down the difference between the two, or talk about what an intervention brief would look like?
Sure. So an intervention. So we don't call them that, just to be clear. We still call them suicide prevention briefs or courses, but what they essentially are us helping Marines and sailors look for the warning signs or invitations. When you see somebody say this, make sure you ask the question, or if somebody gives you some of the indications that they may be thinking of killing themselves, here's how to have a conversation with them and feel comfortable with that, and get them to the next person, whether it be a chaplain or a doctor or whomever. And that's it in brief. And the idea, again, is that's important to know. It's important for people to feel comfortable, because a lot of folks don't ask the question, like, are you thinking of hurting yourself or killing yourself? And do you have a plan? People don't ask because they don't know how to maneuver once they end up in that battle space. And so that is helpful, but it's not prevention. Prevention is setting the conditions such that people are much more likely to choose healthy courses of action that never even get them to the point of feeling, or at least choosing, suicide. it's not reacting to somebody who is indicating that they are. Both have value, but what you're saying, and I would fully agree with, is we've got to put a tremendous amount of energy into shaping the message of here's what a healthy life looks like. Here's what hope looks like, right? We always say in the military or in leadership that hope is not a plan, hope is not a course of action. Well, that's true, except when you're in our business. Hope is absolutely a plan and a course of action, because people need to be able to envision what their life can be like, especially with God fighting in their corner, especially if they give their lives over to experience God's forgiveness and the peace of God that passes understanding, something that can't be explained, but when you experience it, you see the difference. And by the way, skipping all the way to the end of that PME that I shared with 7th Marines, the one major preventative factor in my subjective limited experience that I've noticed with 2-7, the guys who are, no kidding, walking with God believers are the ones that by far do the best and process through some of their stress in the healthiest ways. And I'm just, having read some of the things that you've written, I know you've seen the same thing. I could tell you a couple of stories, but just to say that's critical. You've got to, and that hope is important. That message is important in shaping sort of the environment and setting conditions for folks so they hopefully never get there. There's a lot more to it than that too. I don't want to get into tremendous detail, but part of it is just it's societal messaging. You think about in 2017, there was a series that came out on Netflix. Was it 13 Reasons Why, I believe? And it was basically this gal who sends out all these messages to friends as to why she's going to kill herself. And then the last episode, I believe, it shows her actually doing it. And they saw a spike in suicides among adolescents the month that last episode came out, or that series came out. And you can argue like, well, it was totally coincidental. I think that's a real hard sell personally. The flip side is, if we say, let's minimize that negative messaging, let's talk about mission and belonging and hope and forgiveness and compassion. And some of these things aren't necessarily heralded among grunts. A lot of grunts, their experience when they first get to and this has actually gotten better. I dug into this, I think, with some of the leadership at 7th Marines, and I think the culture is getting better. But a lot of grunts, they get out of SOI, School of Infantry, they get to their first battalion, and within the first week, and often repeatedly for weeks after, they're used to that door getting kicked in and having a boot in their chest, and I don't, it can get a lot worse than that. And so one of the things that I talked about with them was, a lot of young men join the Marine Corps, and women. I apologize if I focus on men, but that was my experience with infantry, and I know you understand that. They join the Marine Corps because they're looking for a connection with sort of this institution that in their mind is going to affirm them as a man. And they're looking forward to a brotherhood, which in their mind, they're going to be tight. They're going to go fight battles together. They're going to have this mission and this meaning. And then these same guys who are supposed to be their protectors and their brothers, in their minds, kind of can become these perpetrators. And so now the catch is, we've got to make sure that guys are tough, that Marines, and sailors are tough, and they're hardened, and they're ready for the difficulties that war presents to them. The difference between, we don't want them becoming dehumanized, which is the risk, but we have to desensitize them and toughen them up to what they're going to do. And so I think there's still ways to do that. I think there's ways to have very structured, somebody once called it, institutionalized hazing, and that's probably a bad term because hazing is not where we want to go. But the idea is, there's ways to physically, mentally, emotionally toughen people even after SOI, once they're in the battalion. But do that in a way that builds esprit de corps. And I think the Marines do a really good job with that, a lot better now than maybe we did back then. So again, a lot of it is just the culture, the conditions that we're creating, that we're setting, not so much just reacting to what we're seeing on the back end, which is the intervention part.
Man, there's so much there.
Yeah.
I will say that line is a hard one for, an infantry platoon commander, which I was, staff NCOs. That's a hard line to walk, to understand when you push and when you shouldn't, and what that looks like. And honestly, reflecting back on even my service, that was a hard thing for me to understand. I think I have a much better perspective now than I did then, but it's important to talk about. I think the fact that we're finally beginning to discuss the reality that so much of what we have identified as combat-related trauma issues are really before combat-related trauma issues that have been brought to the surface because of trauma or because of combat. But really, it's, so much of it is what happened in childhood or, in relationships, maybe even while you were in the military, but not because of combat. And talking about that is so important for so many reasons. One is so with our military folks and our veterans, we can get out in front of it. The other one, though, I think, and this has become more and more important to me, is understanding that the same reasons veterans and active duty service members are taking their lives, it's the same reason people who are civilians take their lives. It's the same kind of causal factors. Trauma is not reserved for veterans. It's not reserved for people who have served in combat. So when I think about my kids, when I think about people in my life, and I want them to be resilient, I don't want them to come to that point where someone's having to intervene, right? Recognize the signs and say something. I need to do the same things you're talking about, to be encouraging, to give hope, to talk about life and what all of that looks like, which to me makes this work so important. What do you say to families, or what would you say to families, because that would be a lot of people who are watching right now who don't have a military connection perhaps, but they do have, teenage kids or young adult children or people they care about, and they're trying to learn these lessons and take some of what you're talking about and apply that to their own situation. How do you help them help the people in their lives become resilient and move forward in a meaningful way?
Wow. And I used to work with adolescents, and you'd think I'd be I would have maybe a better answer than I do for you. But I've worked with Marines and sailors for the last 20 years, so you think I'm used to working with young folk, and
Right.
But I'm just trying to think of how to shape my answer in such a way that it applies to sort of outside the military. I don't know as if I've got any secret sauce for you, Jeremy, but I know this: it is important for every single one of us as parents, myself included, to make sure that we are just spending time with our family. I've made some tough choices in my own career to ensure that I was putting my family before my career, and I don't regret it at all. The Navy has many other 06s or chaplains or whatever that they can move around, or infantry officers or what have you. But my wife only has one husband. My daughter only has one dad. And I think a part of it is you've got to make sure they know that you love them, and that you spend time every day as possible. Obviously, when we're deployed, that's a challenge, but so that there is the same trusting relationship to where my child feels like when they have a bad day or they make a really bad choice or they're feeling low, that I'm a safe person to talk to, that I'm not going to schwack them because they said something that they think I might not want to hear. That in and of itself can build resiliency, in that a big part of resiliency is just learning how to identify the emotions that you're feeling. And some people are, much more sort of calloused than others. Some people feel more deeply than others. Right. That alone doesn't make you weak or strong. In fact, some of the strongest people have the hardest time identifying their emotions, and so it really comes to bite them in the backside. And so modeling for them and showing them not only love and compassion, but helping them sort through that, especially when they're young. And the only way that you can really do that is to give them a safe place to talk and be able to hear some of the hardest things that a parent could hear without just switching to fix it or judgment mode. And I know a lot of parents feel like to do that is an abrogation of their responsibility to parent and to lead. And well, if they say something that's wrong, aren't I obligated as a parent to say, hey, this is wrong, that thinking's wrong, you got to. If you do that, you're going to drive your child away and they're never going to trust you. I shouldn't say they're never going to trust you, but they're going to have a hard time trusting you with the hard stuff. At some point, you have got to be able to sit there and listen and love on them. And just like I think God does with us all the time. I mean, I pour my heart out to God, and, you know, I've never felt like he's shellacked me for it. In fact, if anything, he paid for the consequences of my own bad choices by taking that burden on himself. So, you know, that's a part of it too, is how do you lean into the situation with your child and help bear their burden with them, not for them necessarily, but with them. And then once they can identify and express their emotions, then you can start working on the how. Okay, knowing this is how you're feeling. First, I want you to know I'm always a safe person to talk to. I'm not going to schwack you. I'm not going to try to fix you necessarily. But when the time is right, being able to sit down with them and talk about, okay, you had a hard time at school because you felt like you were getting bullied, or you felt like the teacher embarrassed you in class, or whatever the case might be. That's a hard thing to deal with, isn't it? Yeah. How do you think we can address this going forward? And never to take the agency or the ownership out of their hands. My daughter's experienced other kids bullying. I think every kid probably has, to some degree, bullying or kids being mean to her. And I always, what I often do is I'll say, here's at least a few things that we can do. We can respond this way, or this way. And they're all sort of in my own mind, they have varying levels of intervention on my part, from you can fix this all on your own and I'll cheer you on, to I can get involved if you feel like this is just too much for you to bear. And I can get with the parent, the teacher, whomever. And she becomes involved that way in finding the solution. And the reality is, with most things in life, there isn't just a single hard and fast solution. And so for me to act like that, I don't think it helps her at all. I think so those are two things: being safe and helping them learn how to, in a safe place, identify their emotions, and then working with them on a solution rather than just fixing it for them or telling them how to fix it, and inviting them to be part of the solution. But I'm sure you could get James Dobson on the line and he would give you a much better answer.
Well, what's interesting to me, and why I asked that question, not to take us off topic, but was to, kind of bring us to an intersection where I get asked all of the time about, from pastors, from churches, from people who weren't in the military, how they can serve people who are in the military. Yeah. I've got these folks in my church and they're struggling. I've never been in the military. I don't know what to do to help them.
Okay.
But how you describe helping your daughter, helping your kids and ministering to them, it's the same way that you describe helping Marines. And I guess one of the big takeaways in all of this for me is people are people. What gets them to the place where they're struggling the way that they are, it may be different from one person to another. Certainly it will be. But the solutions are the same, and the process is the same, and how that's played out, again, will be different. Yeah. But it's not, this thing is so different than that thing, and it's so different than this other thing. Really, it's being Christ-like. It's understanding who people are and what they're about. And just hearing you describe that, to me, and I can't speak for everyone, but to me is so helpful. And I think to a lot of people who are watching, that's why we do this, is so that you can hear what we're talking about and then apply that to your own life and find hope in that.
Yeah. Now, it's amazing how many things we already know from we'll call it our work life, that if we would just apply it to home, things would go well. I mean, even when I do marriage counseling, there's time when I was with Marines especially, and we talk about like communication. I would say, okay, let's say you're calling for indirect fire, right? And if you give coordinates, what's the very next thing that guy's supposed to do? Just send rounds down range? No. He's going to make sure he's got the coordinates right, first of all, because he doesn't want to drop rounds on friendlies or miss the target, miss an opportunity. And if we would take that into our communication, I hope my wife doesn't watch this and then laugh at me hysterically, because she probably will, which is
we all think we're doing better
valid.
than we are. It's all right.
But what I say is, why not do that in your marriage? Why not just slow down the process, and instead of just launching rounds or speaking different languages and talking over and under each other, why not just pause and just kind of, the whole slow is fast thing, take it slow, and I know where I'm going with this, where when I say something, I wait for feedback first to make sure I've accurately communicated and it's been accurately heard. And if it hasn't, stop. And, if I were on the radio, I would say negative or incorrect or no, and I would repeat the coordinates. And I need to essentially do the same thing in a respectful, loving way with my spouse or my child. But those kind of lessons we know them because they're tried and true, and they're effective and they save lives in the battlefield, but we don't necessarily make the application to real life.
That's fantastic. All of this, then, we could talk more about all of this, but all of this kind of leads to the Warriors Roundtable, the series of podcasts that you're doing. Can you talk about what that is and why you're doing that?
Yeah, sure. So Warriors Roundtable was actually the name of, tying this into 2-7, it's actually the name of an event, a gathering that I had with the Marines and sailors from 2-7 shortly after I realized one of the things that these guys were struggling with. They were all struggling with it together, but they weren't necessarily talking. Again, it's something that us as men and warriors in particular, we don't do, because we see talking about how we're feeling as a weakness rather than sort of a critical part of health. And so I got everybody together. The battalion commander, took care of the location and the venue, the food, all that. And I got one of the guys that they and actually I just put his second interview out on audio last night. The video will be out next week or so, but Gabe Guest, Gabe at that point, he was just beloved by his Marines, particularly in Fox Company, where he was a staff sergeant at the time. He's now about ready to retire as a master sergeant. And he ended up losing a leg. And he was just, the guys remember him, the Marines remembered him, and the corpsmen as being this just leader, this man among men who in the battlefield was, barking out, even when he was blown up and, his leg is parked somewhere north of his head, he's still barking out orders and trying to do what he can to keep pushing forward. Well, he gets there and I bring him in and he just talks to them, and he talks to them about his experience, and he says, hey, this is what we're doing right here today is what we need to do. We just need to talk. And I've been a firm believer, and you'll hear me say this in the podcast, I think. I'm a firm believer that if we would just simply take time to talk, it would eliminate the need for probably, 90% of the therapy that's out there, because so much of the therapy is because we bottle stuff up and it starts to impact us in a negative way. So I had this this idea, this vision to do this. I wasn't sure how I could help continue to make things better. I've been separated from that battalion for over a decade. I've been connected with the people off and on, but obviously, still active duty, have a pretty robust job. I didn't know what or if I wanted to really do anything to really lay back into this whole idea of helping my brothers in 2-7. How could I do it? Hit me one day that this could be a very effective way to do it, to do interviews, just let them tell their story. It's not me preaching at them or anybody else, because I don't think anybody would tolerate that anyway. It's just me letting them tell their story, but also then saying, it's the hope part. It's like, here's where you come from. Here's the bad news. Now let's get the good news. let's hear what you have done to try to move forward, or what you're doing to try to move forward. And then by telling those stories and sharing those resources, my hope is that it's connecting them with each other, because so many of them are just spread all over the country now as either separated or retired, but also to connect with other Marines or warfighters. But even like you were talking about, even an adolescent who's been pondering suicide, to listen to these stories of overcoming adversity and find something in there that's going to help them for today, or help them take one step closer to getting out of the rut or the pit that they feel like they're stuck in. And so this series is called Not Forgotten, because 2-7 became known as the Forgotten Battalion. And I think a lot of the guys are actually starting to kind of resent that moniker, because they feel like it's a little self-indulgent to kind of walk around like, oh, we're so forgotten. You know, it's like,
Right.
well, maybe, you know, when they first got home, it sounds like they kind of were, and at least that was the perception.
Sure.
And these are some of the, you know, and I'm sure you feel the same way, Jeremy, about the guys you served with. I mean, but these are some of the men that I served with in 2-7, a lot of whom had done that 2008 deployment, are some of the best, hardest Marines and sailors that I've ever met. And I just love these guys, and I have nothing but great things to say about every single one of them. I love them to death. And I wanted to try to make things better for them and anybody else that would listen. I wasn't sure, and I'm still not sure how far that scope is going to go. Just wrapped up my last interview with a Fox Company Marine. My intent is to take a break and start to do some interviews with folks from Gulf and Echo companies, as well as some of the specialized groups like the corpsmen, the Navy corpsmen, the scout snipers, and you know, the biggest challenge, of course, is I have a very robust full-time job that keeps me hopping, and I would pour myself into this podcast if I had the resources. But hopefully, folks can listen to the ones that are on there now and find something to get them through today.
Where can people find that, listen to it, share it?
Warriors Roundtable. If you search for that, if you hashtag Warriors Roundtable, you'll find it. It's there's a Facebook group that I use to periodically hang things that you could join. There's a YouTube channel. It's currently got a black and red logo. It says Warriors Roundtable, and you'll see the videos there. You can also go to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, any of those, and find Warriors Roundtable podcast.
Awesome. We'll do our best to link out to that as well on the show.
Thanks.
Man, so much we could talk about. We need to do this again, because I've got a lot of questions still.
I'd love to.
More questions. So many questions. But
Yeah.
It was awesome, Mo. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate what you've done and what you're doing, what you continue to do.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jeremy. Mighty Oaks is fantastic. And I will just share one last thing that I learned from you that I've shared with folks regularly. In one of your books, you talk about the fact that life can be so chaotic and so difficult, but doing the right thing is rarely difficult. It may not be easy to execute, but it's rarely difficult to discern. And I think that's so true. And one of the things that you provide folks at Mighty Oaks is just that confidence that the next step really isn't that hard, but you give them a safe place in order to talk about their own personal stuff and make that next step. So if anybody's listening to this and has never been to one of your events or retreats, I highly encourage them to check you out.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, man. What a great conversation. For those of you that are watching, thank you for watching. Please do subscribe to our channel. And that lets you know, again, when new content comes online, we're doing stuff all the time. We would love to get that out to you. And, you know, as Mo just mentioned, if you have not been to one of our programs, you fall into that category: veteran, active duty service member, first responder, you're the spouse of one of those, we'd love to invite you. And you can look us up. Our website is mightyoaksprograms.org. Everything you'd want to know about us is there. You can find us on all social media as well. And we'd love to connect. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time.